So, welcome everyone to the writing presentation of this month's Atom. Happy Halloween, belated. We will be talking about linear stories and branching stories today. And it's not really going to be a face off, as the title might suggest. It's more of just a comparison or an analysis of the potential pros and cons that could come with these kind of structures. But we will also be discussing the mediums that use these structures. But first, before any of that, who am I? Because it's good to know who's talking to you uh, before you listen to anything they have to say. So you know me as Deagler on Discord. If you don't, hi, nice to meet you. You might know me also as Harry DeLuca. My name has potentially appeared on some of your writing docs and feedback comment form. I'm studying computer science and engineering at the University of Iowa. And more relevant, more importantly, I am a game writing teacher here in the Arcane University. And I am a writer and one of the senior editors for Beyond Skyrim Cyrodiil, along with Leftover Pad, of course. So, we're going to do some outline of this presentation, because every good story has a beginning, middle, and end. So hopefully that can hold true for this presentation. Anything you do, you should always outline. It helps with organization, coherence, etc. If you want to know more about my thoughts on outlining, I have a very old lecture called Think Before You Write. You can find it on the Arcane University YouTube channel, where I basically rant the entire time. We're going to be covering definitions first. Make sure everyone's kind of on the same page. Then we'll start talking about the differences between linear structure and branching structure. And we can't talk about these two topics without talking about time efficiency. It's just so directly relevant and ingrained in these two topics that we have to talk about it for practical reasons. And if we have time, we'll end with an activity. I'm thinking, though, even if we have time, it'll probably be best served as a mental activity because it really just drives home the point I'm trying to make. So I won't be requiring anyone to be writing anything today. So don't worry. Definitions. We got two definitions. Linear stories are stories that have a preordained progression. These definitions, by the way, are kind of grossly oversimplified for our intents and purposes. I made these are my definitions, my words. There are technical definitions that, various technical definitions you can find on different websites for these kinds of things, but I'm simplifying these structures into just linear and branching because that's really all that's possible within the engine that we are working with, the creation engine, and within the bounds of Skyrim. Branching stories are stories that allow user choice to dictate its progression. And that's the thing everyone wants to hear about is branching stories and user choice. We'll get to that. But I do want to talk first about linearity. So I thought it would be good to start this one off with a little history lesson. It's not going to be boring. I'm going to get straight to the point. The point is we have been telling linear stories for a really long time. If not structured in such a way, the methods and the mediums by which these stories were delivered are linear. around campfires, anything that fits in a book, like a play. The idea that you can now get a say or that you have a say in these stories is kind of a new idea. It's like some 21st century stuff. But the point is that stories have been linear for a lot longer than they haven't. Um, which I think is important to recognize whenever discussing linearity. Because compared to branching, it is uh, not as often as revered as, as branching is, because branching is a very hot topic right now. So what kinds of mediums then are linear? I listed off a few earlier, but things like movies, um, TV shows, and books, as I said before. Side note, if it's like a choose your own adventure book, that's not really the kind of book I'm talking about. And that is a very small minutia of books in general. Textbooks kind of play like choose your own adventure books because they want you to jump between chapters and reference different topics. But um, I'm talking about stories, books written with intent to be stories. So again, we're talking about just the mediums here rather than the structures themselves. I'm kind of hopping between occasionally, so I'll try to clarify which one I'm talking about, uh, if I can. If a statement is confusing, uh, then feel free to ask, and I can try to clarify. This is kind of more freeform, so hopefully all the thoughts, uh, all the trains of thought make it to their destination. Uh,
I'm
so
sorry. So why is the branching circle in the Venn diagram totally empty except for games?
yeah, so we got this Venn diagram here on the right. We got linear mediums and we got branching mediums. There are a lot of linear mediums, and the thing that's interesting about branching is that games are both, or they can be both. They're proven to be successful as either. Um, you look at something like a game with not much choice or really any choice, like Assassin's Creed, or even like just thinking about any actually big AAA kind of series, um, mostly follows linear story structures. Um, while games, it's very niche. Well, not very niche, but there's a smaller audience for people who actually are like really looking for a player agency, but it's catching on more. I believe in the most recent, Call of Duty, they actually added like dialogue choices and like choices whether or not you kill or spare people, which is, crazy that RPG elements like player choice are making it into mainline AAA games. So there's definitely credibility there, but I say games in the cyan blue there, because it's not only video games that can do this, like tabletop games can also be branching. But strictly games are really the only thing where uh, player choice actually comes into play. If you're watching a movie, the director doesn't step out of the screen and ask you what you want to see or where you want to go or what you want to have happen next. It'd be kind of cool, but it doesn't happen. So this little Venn diagram is basically me illustrating the interesting part of what I think this topic is, which is that games can do both, and linear has been proven to work very well. But branching, when it's done right, it also works really well. And I think it gives people kind of like this obligation to write branching, stories and quests for games because games are the only things that can do that. Um, but it's also very important to look at the linear examples of games and seeing how they work and how those things can be reliable. That story structure can be reliable. And that is probably the number one pro of linearity, I would say, is that it's reliable because you can make a new and fresh game idea today and establish that the player has basically no control over its narrative right from the get-go. And people will be fine with that. So long as you're well written and thought out, you're fine. The worst that'll happen is someone will maybe critique it for not having enough player agency, which is just kind of misguided because assuming you design the game, with the intent to include no player agency, as long as you're setting that expectation, um, your audience will be okay with it. So following that, I guess another pro could be that there's a lot of mass appeal with these kinds of stories. But a con would be railroads. Um, Railroading is kind of a topic in itself. But what I'll say about railroading is that it shouldn't happen if a story is well thought out and you write around your obstacles appropriately, regardless of its structure. Um, Railroads are not inherent to linear storytelling. They can happen in any story structure. Just because you're offering a player a choice, you're still only offering them a certain number of choices. So let's say you have a quest with 3 choices that dictate 3 branches. Those 3 choices might not be appealing to anyone if they step up to your game. That could be a design flaw in your quest, but really, like, anyone can feel railroaded into anything if you try hard enough or if you pay not enough attention to the problem. So what I'll say is don't associate railroading with linearity, associate it with bad writing. So let's talk about branching. Branching is defined by player agency. And this is a buzzword. Part of the presentation everyone's kind of waiting for. There's this misconception, I think, that agency is well. Actually, I'm actually curious. Open to the floor. When I say agency, what is the word that pops into your mind? Anyone is free to respond. If not, I'll just tell you because I was probably going to do that anyway. So,
Sorry. And the first word that pops into my mind when I hear player agency, that was the
mhm,
question, right?
yeah,
So, interactivity maybe?
yeah.
I
Um,
typed in choice.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, I can't see the voice text chat. If you ask me questions in voice text, I'll answer them at the end. Yes. So choice. That was the word I was looking for. But um that is only part of the story. Player agency is control, which is like an umbrella over choice. There are 2 kinds of agency here because I'll explain this. Really, what it is it's control for the player. Freedom to approach a situation, freedom to just leave the situation, freedom to. Not every choice is necessarily, slapping you in the face with a prompt. I think Amicus and I had to talk about this in game writing recently in the channel. But there's 2 types of agency. There's active and then there's passive. Um, Active agency is forcing the player to make a choice. Oversimplifying agency to just choice implies that agency is only active. So, active being I take a dialogue prompt and I slap you in the face with it with 3 dialogue options that lead to 3 different branches. An example of active agency can be killing or sparing an NPC. Like, at the end of a quest, you get to choose whether you kill or spare them. This is a choice being actively presented to the player, but if we make choices, we make choices all the time without being prompted. Choose to stand up, choose to walk somewhere, go to the bathroom, anything. It's like sometimes the choice isn't so clear. That is a passive choice. And choices like that are made passively in games. These terms are also non-technical. These are words that I'm assigning to them because I think they paint the picture pretty well. Sandbox games like the Elder Scrolls have passive agency. That's actually, Skyrim allows you to go virtually anywhere at any time. Same with Oblivion, same with Morrowind. Where you go and what you do is ultimately up to you. That's arguably the best part of Elder Scrolls games, is the passive agency given to the player. Elder Scrolls has always kind of thrived on a passive style more than an active style. Obsidian with Fallout New Vegas leans more on, both, to be honest. They do both because it's the same world style, but then they also incorporate the activeness in their quest design, the activeness of player agency and quest design. So if we look at the little flowchart on the right here, you'll see the start and then the 3 different endings based on the player's choice. And actually, if you cover up, the 2 side branches, this is actually just a linear structure, right? So that's important to realize as well, is that linearity is, there is a linear story in every branching story. Linear stories make up branches. If you're a player and you play through a quest one time, you experience one branch and that's it. You might think, oh, that was a linear story. Like there was no, because a lot of players don't recognize the choices, the active choices. Designers do, but average players, they just go through the quest and it's like, oh, that might have just been a no choice scenario. I don't even realize that I made one. So if branching are the branches of your quest, then the linear story is the trunk. It is the trunk of your tree, so to speak. And I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation again. But if you notice, it was intentional that the branching actually happens later in the quest rather than at the beginning. Imagine that this quest had its branch right after the start node. It would essentially be 3 separate quests crammed into one, right? That is not good design. You might be able to pitch a reason narratively why it should happen, but the counter reason would just be, okay, well, if you really want that to be the case, then maybe just make this a separate quest that the same character offers. Because having it's a different design philosophy than what Skyrim and even honestly, Fallout New Vegas and like Obsidian versus Bethesda's style is that Obsidian, even though they branch more, they still do it later in the quest, because the longer you give the player with these characters, and the longer they're engrossed in this plot, the more meaningful the decision will be. That's why there's so many decisions that happen at the end of a story rather than the beginning. Because if you're doing them at the beginning, that has like huge like design implications. You have to write a lot more. There's just a larger workload for everyone in that instance, and larger workload isn't necessarily bad. It's just that there needs to be a purpose behind it. If it can be easily avoided, then it'll be easily avoided, right? So I'll say one of the pros of branching is obviously player agency. People really like it. Having an impact on the story is cool, and that is one of the strong suits of games, is having an impact on things. One of the cons would just be workload. And that is a super, super important point when talking about real world practicality. Imagine you're writing a book. Let's say it's Game of Thrones. And you're writing Game of Thrones because someone wants to finish it, and you write it all the way through. It takes a lot of time, right? You're just writing one book, or well, you're writing the whole series. It takes a long time to make. Done. Imagine if you had to write like 4 different versions of the same story all the way through. Chances are you would run into a problem where your singular version, where you wrote it all the way through, is probably going to be much longer than your branching version. If we look at just this chart on the right, if this were a linear story, it could be 10 nodes longer probably. It's the fact that you have to account for all the different outcomes that makes it shorter. So ideally, you want your playtime to be the same, regardless of the structure, because you don't want to just give people choices and then end the quest in 5 minutes, right? You want to give people choices and then have those choices have an effect, and like a noteworthy effect that doesn't just last, for a short amount of time. And maybe that noteworthy effect transcends the quest. Maybe it doesn't. That's a different discussion. But the point stands. So that's what I have to say about a branching. But we're going to talk about time efficiency now, which has to do a lot with that. I touched on it a little bit already, obviously. Our time is valuable, right? Like we want to be efficient in anything we do, not just writing, just, we want to be efficient people. It is easier to achieve a well-written and thought out linear story than branching in terms of time. And that's not to discourage anyone. It's just giving the facts, is that a quest that is linear will take less time than a branching one. As long as they're the same length, right? Same playtime. And whether or not you do feel obligated to, write this, there is no obligation, right? In a branching structure, there's no obligation to write in that fashion. It's it is very rewarding when it's done well. But the interesting thing about, I don't want to say the market, but the audience the game audience today is that most people, if they're buying a story game, they don't mind if it's a linear one, because oftentimes that will lead to a more thoughtful story, less confused thematically, right? Because you don't have to account for all these outcomes. So I personally encourage all writers to focus on creating fun, well-written linear experiences, because we're all still learning, right? I'm still learning. Writing is a constant learning process. You're never done learning how to write, right? So you're never also, by proxy, done learning how to write for games. So I think it's all important for us in our current situation, AU, and mod project perspective, is to recognize where we are on a macro, perspective. We're not professionals. Branching requires design knowledge, and we're all still in the process of figuring that out. Everyone, even in industry, is still in the process of figuring that out. But in the AU here, we don't have a specific design courses on how to handle things like overbranching and how you should manage your ideas within the quest. What you're trying to achieve when you write something. You can be a really good writer, but you could be very unwieldy with your quest structures. It could branch off the page and never be seen by the player if you're not careful. So I encourage people to focus on learning to write the linear stories, and then once you have a really good trunk to your tree, you work on the branches. Because if you have a dinky little trunk, right, very loose, not great story, not fun story, then your branches are going to be huge and they're going to weigh down the trunk and make a droopy little tree. And no one likes droopy trees, right? So have a really good trunk. What I'd say is you should try to branch later, obviously, but this is what I do when I write a quest. I write the linear version of the quest, right? Because in every branching story, there's a linear story. So I write the best version of that branch, I guess. Like, pick from what is the best possible experience the player can have in this quest. I write it, and then I go through it, and I say, hey, where, if I were the player, would I want to potentially make a different choice, right? And then I think, well, how could I facilitate that choice with my structure? Where can I add branches that make sense for the story rather than design my quest around a decision structure that comes out hollow rather than being fully filled with story? So managing your scope is really important. Making sure you stay focused on what exactly it is you're trying to achieve. And honing in on that goal of trying to create a fun experience. After you do that, then you can add those choices so they arise naturally rather than being intentionally designed for that purpose. Someone told me a long time ago, never what was it? Well, I was just thinking about it. Never substitute or never place agency over the story. player choice not at the expense of the narrative. So player choice, good. At the expense of the narrative, not good, right? And a lot of people don't really manage, they don't check themselves when they do that. So they end up just making choices that impede on the narrative and make droopy trees, right? Instead of thick trunks with long, nice branches. So who cares, right? I essentially spent time on explaining that, I think, and the self-awareness that comes along with it. I think we are in a position where we're all, learning together. Like I said before, and to objectively say something is right and wrong is obviously not the way to go. But from what I have observed in student quest as my time as a teacher, and even on a project, like I said, this is a problem everywhere, is that branches are added that aren't necessarily healthy for the story. And to say something is healthy and unhealthy is difficult to explain, but design comes with experience and time on how to recognize these things. And over time, I think everyone will have a better idea. Ideally, in the future, all games are branching focused, right? Because they're the only things that are able to do it. So in the future, maybe every game has a branching structure. But currently, we're in the process of making that happen. We just have to learn to make a strong base before we move forward. So this is that mental activity I was talking about. I kind of already did it. It seems like we're getting toward the end of this presentation here. I don't really know how long I've talked for. 30 minutes, okay. But if people would like to take part in this activity, it would be to write 1 3-paragraph story and then write 3 1-paragraph stories within, I guess until the end of the lecture. And how that would play out, right? It would have to be a lot more condensed, and maybe you lose some of the theme you're going for. If your 3-paragraph story is all about how a guy overcomes his fear of being shy and goes to, let's say, talk to the lady he likes or something like that. You might have some, themes of love and maybe like a powerful moment for this character where he decides that he's going to do it, right? In your 1-paragraph stories, what does that look like, right? Maybe you have one version where he does exactly that. It follows that exact, idea. Maybe there's another one where he instead has his friend do it, i.e., like the player, who delivers like a note. And then maybe there's another one where he the friend discourages him and he doesn't, right, confess his love. It's interesting because there's obviously a much more appealing story in that moment, in this quest idea, or in this little paragraph story we're thinking of. I'm thinking of it as a quest now, but there's obviously one that is most appealing, and then there's one that's maybe a little more loose, like you kind of just skipped out on the story by telling him, no, you shouldn't, you're too good for her, or something like that, right? And then boom, like the quest is over, or the quest is never proposed. That is a philosophy that Bethesda does not have. They don't want the player to just skip out on content and lock it behind a door. If this were a real thing, the guy would just say, "Oh, maybe you're right. Maybe I'll think about it some more." And then the player could come back and do the quest anyway, right? It never gets locked off. But some games do lock you off, like Baldur's Gate 3 and other more modern RPGs. Larian Studios likes to do that, is lock off content depending on how you play it, but Bethesda does not. So,
Morrowind does.
hmm?
I said Morrowind does.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
pretty sure. Yeah.
which quest is that?
I don't know. I just remember meeting someone outside of town a long time ago, and I said, "No, I won't help you because I didn't want another quest in my journal." But then he just wouldn't speak to me anymore. So I've messed that up a bit.
Right. And some players have different preferences, right? Like on what they like. I don't think there's objectively a right way to do things. But as a designer, I'm someone who, if I make a quest, I, hopefully the player doesn't just skip it, right? Like I'd want the player to do it. And I could probably think of a reason as to why this character doesn't just immediately drop it, right? Like that guy you talked to in Morrowind, there's probably a good enough narrative reason for him not to just that's like placing character over like content at that point. It's this guy being cold to you now because you rejected him the first time, when in reality he could potentially just have a different reason for wanting the player to help him as like when they come back a second time. And that's
Yeah.
the philosophy that a lot of the games have taken to now, the later games.
Yeah, but I guess it depends on the quest given, and I do not remember what the quest was. So maybe it was something like mercenary work where he could easily find someone else. I don't know, but yeah, I get what you're trying to say.
Yeah. Hopefully it wasn't anything too big, right? Imagine
No,
if you did
it's
that
just
for like
something outside of town.
imagine if you did that for a main quest, right? Let's think about that. Uh the the philosophy is apparently okay when it's on a more micro scale. Like, yeah, it's okay if the player just decides that they don't want to do this. But then when you get to quest lines, it's like, whoa, we can't let them skip the main story. Like that's the main story, right? Fallout 4, it did that. So, and people didn't like that actually. Vast majority of people did not like how if you chose a side, then the other side was just unplayable. It's interesting. Game developers are moving toward a like more agency, no matter what, like do more agency. But it's interesting because I think to a point too much agency actually does harm the player experience, and maybe not necessarily the story, but definitely the player experience. And even if it's not for everyone, harming it for everyone, then it's harming it for certain people who you can't please everyone, but there is an audience for both styles, I suppose.
Yeah, and if I can just add for the Fallout, for example, I'm kind of torn on that one because I like that one of the few things that actually matters in the game, like what faction you choose. But it's also a bit of a bummer because, as you said, you can't choose the other factions in that same playthrough. Well, you kind of can if you go with the Minutemen and then have some. You don't really. It's like the most free faction. You can still interact with the Railroad and Brotherhood of Steel. But if you choose any of the others, in most of the endings, you just have to destroy the others, right? So you miss out on a lot of content. So yeah, I can see the pros and cons.
Yeah, it's all about what the company values, or what the developers value, and what the fans value. the companies have to, or the developers have to know their fans, right? I think a lot of Elder Scrolls fans are completionists. They like being everything. The moment Oblivion created that title system, for achieving different ranks and guilds and even titles for just simple things like closing, well, not simple necessarily, but smaller things like closing an Oblivion gate outside of Coral. You got like the Knights of the Thorn tag, um, and then all the DLCs gave you titles as well. That really incited a completionist mentality among Elder Scrolls fans, and I think it was already there probably with all the different guilds in Morrowind, but Oblivion just stoked the fire, and so the philosophy that they have reflects their fan base, I suppose. Except with Fallout 4, and I think that's why people didn't like it, is because it's the audience that likes completionism or being a completionist, but then they made this choice that now isn't you can't complete everything in Fallout 4 unless you do another playthrough.
Yeah, I think Fallout 4 is really the example of an average game. I wouldn't say it's bad, but I wouldn't say it's a perfect. I wouldn't say it's perfect.
Yeah, that game could have its own presentation in itself. But anyway, we're basically in the question and answer stage. I don't have anything prepped, outside of the activity. I'm not going to be reviewing anything currently. If you guys have any questions for me, I'll be happy to answer them. This is the unofficial end of the presentation.
I'm not sure if you already mentioned, but what's your opinion on the branching of Fallout 4?
Well, I'm in the mind of on Beyond Skyrim, we try to we don't lock off content. We might have branching, but what Bethesda did in Fallout 4 is in my opinion different, from what Obsidian did. Obsidian added branching in the micro quests, like you're only locking off of, if you choose one branch, you're only locking off a very, very small segment of content from the rest of the game. Your choice still had a consequence, but it was a smaller instance. And if you bring up the example at the end of the quest line where you can choose to kill or spare the legate, then that's at the end of the quest line, and that's encouraged. If you ever do a big branching decision, it's not even a branch at that point. It's like a leaf. It's like two little leaves at the end, where you're either killing him or sparing him, and that doesn't really actually have a huge consequence, but it feels good to be able to have that choice, right? I think, to try and focus more on Fallout 4, they locked off too much content. I like the branching. I don't think it was the right philosophy in that regard, on that large of a scale. Smaller scale would be better, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. These micro decisions also come up in just standard dialogue with characters for our, context in Skyrim when we're writing for a NPC. You can have an initial encounter where, if this NPC isn't anyone participating in any quests or anything largely important down the line, you can just have them an initial encounter, which basically determines whether or not they want to talk to you anymore. Kind of similar to what you were talking about with the Morrowind example. These dialogue instances, will it's kind of like the Morrowind example. What I'm talking about is a character that is unrelated to a quest. They're just hanging around, and to make them interesting, you give them an initial encounter where they basically define who they are and what they're like. And it's like a little mini game for the player. And if you fail at the mini game, essentially this NPC doesn't want to talk to you anymore. But that is the only consequence. It's not like there's content being locked off behind this NPC not wanting to talk to you anymore. It's just a character thing.
I have a technical question, if I may.
Sure, shoot.
All right. I'm not sure if you've covered this in previous lectures because it's my first time. But
Welcome.
thank you. When you're writing a branching story, which I've been trying to do for the past month or so,
Okay.
how do you keep track of all the branches? Because I'm having trouble, like trying to not lose my mind while writing this.
Yeah. So this isn't maybe the most helpful, but if you're writing it for, are you writing it for Skyrim?
No, unfortunately, I'm writing it for something
Okay.
else. But I've been having trouble with like keeping track of all the branches, and I've tried to write it in Excel. They said it might be easier.
Mhm.
I've tried writing it in a flowchart kind
Yeah.
of format, the way you have here, and it's just driving me nuts, basically.
Yeah.
So, any recommendations or help in that regard I would appreciate it very much.
Yeah. So there I personally if you've tried it already, like you said, flowcharts. But there are a lot of tools out there. Twine is namely the one I think of immediately that helps with organizing things, branches in essentially what you could consider a pseudo flowchart. If you're on a document and you're trying to label branches, what I would do is I would have a flowchart and the document side by side. And similarly to how I have like ending 1, ending 2, ending 3, you can label these with names and then have those names appear on the document as well. So let's say you get to this branch. I think you guys can see my mouse. You get to this node here, and you want to call this node like decision or something. And one is kill, and then one is spare. You can have these branches labeled like spare branch, kill branch, and leading to their respective endings. The problem with documents is that they also progress in a linear fashion. You have to just keep going down,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
and it makes it confusing. We've tried our best to make our format have like nice colors and stuff to help people recognize like branch labels and stuff like that. If you aren't using colors yet, I think I would encourage that. Other than that, I think it's just a matter of maybe having like a second monitor and pulling it up or pulling it up side by side and just trying your best to label things and follow those labels.
Okay. Thank you so much for your reply.
Yeah, sure. No worries.
I had a question that I left in the lecture hall chat.
Sure.
Are there any places where Beyond Skyrim differs from Bethesda in design philosophy, just writing how they write quests? or is it just pretty much meant to feel like Bethesda made more provinces?
Well, we're trying to be as professional as possible. But there's also so hopefully the professionalism is there. But then there's also we are adhering more to a Fallout New Vegas style philosophy. With that said, I still think most of our we're writing for Skyrim, which has a precedent set for it that it's not like that. It's not with that philosophy. So we're doing like a slight mix, I would say. It's we have Fallout New Vegas style, but there's still quite a few linear stories and quests, and we're really more so focusing on the impact of the decisions, I would say. So in that vein, not too far away from what Bethesda did for Skyrim, but also not too far away from what Fallout New Vegas did. Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually the recommendation by a friend who got a lot of experience writing branching storyline. She said, you might try using Excel for now because it might help you to wrap your head around it better. So,
And would you
yeah.
say that it is?
Being that I have uh, dyscalculia, no, not really.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of been breaking my head the past weeks.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because the format that we use for our quest design and our NPCs, with how we include notes for voice actors and for implementers, like in the line, in a Word document, essentially, is unique, kind of. It doesn't really follow what most people do, which is both a blessing and a curse, because I think it makes things more tightly knit and easier to work with. It makes it easier to work with for everyone. That everything's kind of nicely in the same place and everyone's familiar with the format we're working with, because it's hopefully intuitive, than something like an Excel doc, which doesn't. You can still include the notes, but everything is more. It's different. Don't want to say it's better or worse, but it's different.
Okay, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, sure. Something I can go back and talk about a bit now that I'm seeing it again is the deadlines. You know,
Deadlines.
I
Don't you
think
just love
that
them?
I think it's more. I don't want to say self-explanatory, but if you're writing for a branching quest, it'll take more time than a linear, so long as you want it to be the same length. So keeping in mind, your deadlines and what is most practical for implementation. If you're not already, like if you're not in any studio or anything, I'm not in a studio, but I still think having self-set deadlines for yourself is really good because you can train yourself for what you should be prepared to do, which is right within time constraints, right? They're not fun necessarily. I'm pretty lax with my own. What I aim to do is one thing per month, which is a
Yeah.
location, a quest, like just one thing. If I finish it in its entirety and I send it, to be reviewed, that's a month. That's a success, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You just keep a steady workflow, and decide what you want to do this month.
On my end, I've been writing for a long time now, but not. I kind of left creative writing behind after uni, so I have been writing to deadline to my career, except not creative things.
Right.
Extremely not creative things, scientific stuff. So it's been difficult trying to get back into to that creative voice. I think, and probably something that other people also struggle with. So
Yeah.
maybe if someone more experienced with writing in this kind of context could maybe give us some tips about that. If whatever works for you guys. I mean, your experience with that, I would appreciate that very much.
I think something that Pencil mentioned last lecture, this isn't something I've done, but I've actually seen it in a lot of YouTube videos for writing, is having mood boards, for basically compiling things that inspire you, or are in a similar vein to each other, and how they encapsulate kind of like a certain feeling, I guess, and theme, perhaps, what you're looking for. Uh, what I do is, the thing that always works for me is listening to music, or finding just individual pictures. I can usually find like a really cool piece of art when it's something completely like personally creative, something like a D&D character or something. A picture helps a lot. When it's writing for a specific world or project, having music from that project, to help immerse myself in what I'm trying to do, helps a lot personally. It's different for everyone though.
Yeah, that's true. I guess on my end, it's just been very challenging trying to get back into that groove, I suppose. But we'll get there.
Mhm.
We'll get there eventually.
Well, what's interesting for me is that music, I actually can't really write that well while listening to music. What
Mhm.
happens is I'll be listening to music and then I'll like zone out for like a minute, or my brain is
Yeah,
just doing, you know, like it's
yeah.
imagining something, and then that's the thing that I end up, like, I just focus on thinking about how do I want to do something in a quest. Like when I hit a brick wall, sometimes I
Mm.
just lay on the floor and I stare at the ceiling to try and help.
Seriously,
Oh
you lay
yeah,
on the floor.
yeah, sometimes.
Okay, that could work. Yeah,
It's sometimes it's just about a change of perspective, Um,
true. Yeah, that's true. Which has been a
it's
bit more difficult to find with COVID. You
right.
can't
Yeah,
go out so much, to change to
yeah,
kind of jerk your brain into a different mentality, I
yeah,
suppose.
yeah.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
noticed that going out really helps my creativity.
Yeah, it does.
Because
But
when I look at the same room for like days on end, it is just
yeah,
you get surprised when you go out and just ideas start rushing in, motivation, inspiration, everything. So
yeah, true.
yeah,
Well,
Inspiration from everything. That's the I've been actually reading a textbook recently, Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell, and
oh,
it has a
Art of Game
story.
Design by Jesse Shaw.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm gonna look that up.
This is the first textbook I've ever read for fun. And it's got stories in it, from this guy's life and from famous people. In one of them, he talks about a guy who juggles, just like some dude in like a yellow jumpsuit who was juggling. He's real old, and I'll try to tell the story well, not butcher it. But essentially, this guy, the author who met this guy, he was like a kid when he met him. Author was like 12, and he was just watching this old guy juggle, and the guy was doing these amazing tricks, coolest things this kid had ever seen. No one else was doing them. People were trying to copy him, but they weren't doing a good job. And the old guy's like, "Come on, join me." And the kid's like, "I don't think I can do that." And the old guy basically drops some sage wisdom and says that the best way to get back into it or to be inspired is to look everywhere that isn't other people doing the same thing you're doing.
Ooh,
Like
that's a good one.
he's like he flips the beanbag up in the air and it starts doing this like little flapping thing like a bird, and he's like, learned this one from a flock of geese taking off a lake. And then he like starts doing all these different tricks. I learned this one from a hole puncher in Staples or something, like all of these random cool trick ideas. So he says they can try to copy him, but they can't copy the inspiration. And that's really cool. So if you're trying to get in a writing headspace, looking at other people trying to write like the same thing you're writing and trying to be different from them, I think will lead to a more locked in, headspace, rather than just
Yeah.
looking at like a flock of geese take off from a lake and just suddenly being inspired and writing a quest about that or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just
So
really cool.
basically, don't imitate an imitation
Yes.
for the source.
Yeah, exactly. Don't do what everyone else is doing. That's kind of
Worlds like Game of Thrones the world of Game of Thrones and J.R.R. Tolkien, they J.R.R. Tolkien set the tone for the fantasy world, and essentially every fantasy world that has come after has been some kind of an imitation of it, and not a fully realized, differentiation. There are still elements that carry over, which is really interesting.
I was just recently thinking how fantasy is always like it houses the same races. It's always elves, orcs. It's the same things in different universes. It's like a staple. And I was thinking, if anyone was to make up their own little fantasy world, and they had to make new kinds of creatures, humanoid creatures, possibly to better fit basically, I think it would be very hard because
yes,
you could always find something that links them to other established creatures, and it's like your brain would always go back to, I don't know, orcs or elves because they're so ingrained in fantasy now.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's so many other mythologies that you could base a fantasy world around, but it's mostly just orcs and elves.
So that is the official, and we ran over time a little bit. Sorry for next time slot.